Hello, I'm Joshua. I'm an INTP. Thank you for visiting this video, and in this video, I would like to discuss the topic of reality as an information network, or as I've said in previous videos, one can think of reality as an information-rich matrix. So, first, to discuss what I mean by reality being an information-rich matrix, it's important to understand some terms in system analyses. And primarily, these terms are going to be borrowed from statistical uh, procedures and research methodology terms. And firstly, I would like to start with when you're analyzing a system, some of the important things to pull out of the system are the variables at which are at play within the system. Depending on the complexity of the system you're analyzing, for example, a system can be a car motor, it can be a battery, it could be a network of circuits, it could be anything from something very simple that has changes and variances in it over time due to some sort of effect or something large and complicated. In reality, insofar as when one analyzes it, is a type of system. And so there are variables to reality. And when one looks at the variables, but putting reality aside and just saying systems in general, when one looks at variables, one is concerned with variables insofar as how they relate to one another and the causal nature of the variables in relation to each other. So, two things that one looks for is correlation and variance. Correlation would be the type of what causes what to change. Does A cause B, or does B cause A, or does C cause A, which causes B, or does C cause B and C cause A independently? It's to say A, B, and C are variables. They're elements of the system that interact with one another, and they promote some sort of change. This change is denoted as variance, and variance can be something that's large, or it can be something that's small. Things change over time, but what that change really is can be described in a number or a ratio, and that number or that ratio can be large or it can be small. And this is a generalization, but it will just serve in the purposes of what I'm talking about and how lay audience can understand how my mind is working when I'm talking about something. And this change is known as an effect size. And the effect size, it has a magnitude. A magnitude just means the size of something, how big it is, how small it is. Not the direction of it, as in talking about something on a number line, either going left or right, not whether it's facing north, south, east, or west, but just the general shape of the line, the general shape of the general shape, but insofar as it being a size or a representation of something that's occurred. So you can think of it as an explosion. Does the explosion have a large radius, or does it have a small radius? If an explosion has a large radius, irregardless if that explosion happens to the east or to the south of something, we care about the general magnitude of it. That's going to tell us a lot about the effect it's going to have on the environment, and it can either be small or it could be large. So, with that said, I think it's important to understand with what science, in particular biology, has classified nature as, and nature is a type of system which we call a self-organizing system. And you may not be familiar with what a self-organizing system is, but nature is a self-organizing system, and a very simple and easy example you can find of a self-organizing system on YouTube would be a double-arm pendulum. It's something that is of great interest in research in physics and chaos theory, But what's important to note about self-organizing systems are that when we're talking about effect sizes, we're talking about change that happens and the degree of change that happens and the size of change that happens, how much that's going to affect what we're seeing present in the system. In a self-organizing system, small effect size of small magnitudes may cause massive changes, while effects effect sizes of large magnitudes may cause no change at all, or no visible change, at least that can be measured. Also, something that's important to note about self-organizing systems is minute changes collected over time leave enormous cascading effects at the point of analysis, or when we sit there and analyze a system. That may seem all abstract, but another way to think about it is weather patterns. When we're looking at weather patterns, what really causes the weather to act the way it does? A good example is arguments for global warming is carbon emission, insofar as the argument for global warming being a thing. But one thing you'll hear politicians or conservatives who argue that there is no such thing as global warming is that the CO2 emission ratio is so small. Well, the reason that this argument doesn't really work is because insofar as how the atmosphere is set up and how the compounds and elements interact with one another, you don't need a great deal amount of CO2 to really start causing some serious and drastic change over time. You only need a small amount of it, because the variables that are involved, the way that they correlate and interact with one another, it's not so straightforward as in it obeys our intuition that you put a lot of sugar in water, it's going to just get sweeter. You put a little bit of sugar in water, it's going to be less sweeter. It's like you can think of it more in terms of different sugar sweeteners. You may put classic cane sugar in something. You need a larger amount to make the sweetness rise in the drink. But if you take and put Splenda or any of these artificial sweeteners that are higher in their sweetening veracity, you can think of it like that, or higher in their sweetness magnitude, you don't need as much sugar. You don't need as much of them as you do something like simple cane sugar to get the same effect and the sweetness of something. So nature works in this way to where it's puzzling and confusing in how it organizes itself. So many organic systems, it seems, are self-organizing systems. The brain is a self-organizing system. Weather, I mentioned that before, is a self-organizing system. Nature itself is a self-organizing system. The cosmos and the universe are. It's just that this seems to be the way that systems that are not man-made arrange themselves. It's pretty interesting and peculiar. Why that's important is that when I'm talking about reality being a matrix of information, or a network of information, it's because I'm thinking of it as a self-organizing system, and I'm thinking about all these things such as variance and effect size and correlation amongst variables. So we as people, or organisms just in general, you have a collection of DNA within an environment, and the environment acts on it, and the DNA, we'll just go with the DNA. The DNA sits and acts in the environment, and between the environment acting on it and it acting in the environment, a process happens, and that process is causing change in the organism itself. It's also causing minute changes in the environment, which is not easy to see with all other life forms and organisms until you remove them out of an ecosystem. But ecosystems are also things that are self-organizing systems. They just don't behave intuitively. So I won't stress that point anymore, but it's to say this, that the change over time, it's minute, but the reiterative nature of it and the cyclical nature of that change makes it a cascading sort of change that has enormous effects over that organism's life form. And it's how you can take something simple and produce something from something simple as amoeba and produce something as complex in its organization as a human being. That baffles so many people's minds and seems amazing, but it's because of the nature of the systems themselves. It's because of what we're looking at, and so far as what an organism is, what nature is, what reality is, and reality seems to be a self-organizing system, and this sort of Newtonian intuitive notion about you just need more of something or less of something to make something happen just doesn't work to explain why things are the way that they are. This model seems to explain why things are the way they are much better than anything else we can seem to come up with in terms of organic systems, not mechanical or mechanistic ones. And it's also to say that when we're when we're looking at that organism, and we're looking at its ability to act in this self-organizing system, which seems somewhat chaotic and random, but underlying the minute changes and the gross major changes, there are patterns and habits that are overarching all changes and how these variables relate to one another. And when we're talking about reality being, when I'm talking about reality being an information-rich matrix, what I'm saying is that the mind, it is set up in such a way to notice these variances, notice the correlations, notice the effect sizes, in a sense to notice change. And why is it important for an organism to notice change? And I mentioned this in a previous video, is because whether or not we notice change, or whether or not we pick up this relationship between the variables, whether or not it's the global system itself or just the localized ecosystem we live in, or just the small region and community which we live in this larger overarching ecosystem, determines life or death. It's that simple. As an organism, as an organic life form, you don't want to die. There's an irrational impulse within all living things not to die. Human beings are fairly peculiar in the sense that we need more than just the impulse to survive. We need also meaning, or else we may even take our own lives. But with that said, it's just to say that it's paramount for us to be able to pay attention to how reality emerges from this network, from how these variables are interacting, and how we're interpreting that variation or that correlation. Good interpretation, good realization and organization of information leads to better results. Even if it doesn't necessarily kill us, it may not get us ahead in our race to proliferate and survive. And it's that meshing point between reality being the self-organizing system that it is and having somewhat of the chaotic elements that it has to it, and us being these also emergent beings out of the system itself that interacts with the system and acts on the system, that we have this thing called information emerge. Information seems to be and I don't want to seem too metaphysical in saying this, but a phenomenological aspect. It's something that's extant because of experience. And I wish I could describe it in more concrete language, but it's rather difficult. What can be delineated can be communicated, but it's very hard to delineate this idea, at least where I'm currently at in my understanding of it. It's to say that we emerged out of this process of variables organizing themselves. It's as simple as atoms coming together in the right solution and forming together in some sort of strand of RNA, and that reproducing itself into a more complex structure through being within this emerging system and acting against this system and having the system affect it over time. It's just that seems to be where we came from. The details of it, I can't tell you. I don't know many who can, at least with empirical certainty, though there is no real certainty in empiricism. It's just to say that we're we're an emergent process just as much as the system is emergent and chaotic itself. And it seems to be that there is this sort of balance or correlation between what is known and what is unknown. And between this balance and correlation, this interaction between the known and unknown, the organic life form and the actions and reactions of the system, I suppose one can think of it like that. This sort of data, static, fuzz, white noise, hue, something which we call information emerges. And I don't know if that means information is embedded within reality, but I know that brains, they are set up, whether it's from simple life forms to complex life forms, they are set up to differentiate information and make associations among it. It seems that everything is pretty keen on looking at what a thing is in relation to itself and what it should do because of what a thing is. And what a thing is seems to be roughly what is a tool, what is an obstacle, and what is unknown. And it's to me so peculiar that the mind is shaped like this, because as far as I'm concerned, I have a Darwinian perspective, and I think the mind has been shaped by nature through evolution itself. It's to say that if we process the world like that, it would mean that animals do the same thing, roughly speaking. It's to say that anything does the same thing, roughly speaking. And what's even more so interesting about that is just how do you get information out of inanimate objects? It's like we create narratives in our minds. All animals, it seems like we are concerned with causal elements. We like cause and effect, and to see what causes what in order to draw some sort of pattern of reasoning out of it so that we can therefore decide how to act. That's why I think that the question of ethics is always going to be a valid one in any time period, not merely because of the political and moral arguments that exist in the period, but because what one ought to do seems to be a fundamental question to all organisms that have ever existed in reality since the existence of organisms. It's something that's so deep and enmeshed in what it means to be, what it means to exist on all levels, that it's just so peculiar and so interesting. And I hope that this is making clear why I think seeing reality as a self-organizing system and seeing nature as a self-organizing system leads me to come to the conclusion that reality is a information-rich matrix, and why that would have something to say about what people are and how the brain works. I just think that that makes sense. If nature is this thing and it behaves in a certain way, and we're made from that behavior, then we have to behave in a certain way. And knowing that certain way in which nature behaves is going to tell us a whole lot about how we behave. And I think if we're concerned with personality and what psychology is, then we would have to address the middleman and the instigator of it all, just to get a clear picture. And I suppose it's here that I'll summarize in saying that when I'm analyzing a system, it comes down to the variables of the system. It comes down to variance and effect size roughly. And when we're looking at nature, we're looking at a specific type of system, which would be a self-organizing system, which would uh, have certain properties to it that are chaotic in nature, roughly speaking. You can think of a double arm pendulum. You can also know from that that small things, when they're reiterated over time, lead to large effects and cascading ones, and large and profound changes can produce no change in the system at all, which is so bizarre. It's and human beings and all organisms and their cognition are a result of this system. And so cognition and human existence is affected by this system. And the cognition at which the being has, its reaction with the system continues to change it even more to be more so what it is over time, or be more so better fitted for what reality is over time. And this interaction between what the organism is and what the system tells it and what it does in it is information. And that's the best way I can say it, and hopefully that elucidates that idea for you. Thank you.